Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our weekly congressional chats. No question that the big event in Congress this week was the unprecedented and extraordinary address by President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine. Let me set the stage a little bit for you. I think this is the first time Congress has ever been addressed by a foreign leader who was literally speaking from a combat zone, from the capital of his country, with the enemies literally at the gates, the Russians, and who had already been the subject of three different Russian assassination plots that we know of. It was an extraordinary moment, and I must say that President Zelenskyy certainly rose to the moment. It's probably the most Churchillian, if I may use that adjective, thing I've ever seen in my congressional career. The speech itself, I would argue, was a miniature masterpiece, and whoever put it together, really knew how to deliver a telling message to a congressional body that was already very sympathetic. Obviously, President Zelenskyy began his address with people in awe of the courage he's shown over the last 3 weeks, his leadership, his unwillingness to flee the capital of his own country, even when the United States offered him safe access out. Instead, he stayed with his people and helped keep them in the fight against the Russians. So I think people were prepared to hear a good message. I think they got a better message than they bargained for. The opening, President Zelenskyy was seated, speaking straight into the camera, very resolute, very determined. He thanked the American people, he thanked the Congress, and he thanked the administration for the help that he'd already received, and he did what anybody else in his situation would do. He asked for more. He asked for a no-fly zone. He asked particularly for aircraft and additional weaponry. He spoke for 15 or so minutes, again, through a female translator. Then he asked us to look at a video, and the video obviously had been put together by Ukrainian producers, and it was incredibly powerful. It showed first the beauty of the country and its people, and then all the horrors that have been visited upon them in the last 3 weeks: bombardments, fleeing refugees, frankly, I'm sad to say, dead women and children, mass graves, brave soldiers defending their country against overwhelming odds. It was pretty gut-wrenching to watch. And fortunately, not only Congress saw it, but I hope you had an opportunity to see it. And if you haven't, I would urge you to pull it up on YouTube and take a look. And then the final portion of it, President Zelenskyy talked to us in English and again reiterated the request, the appreciation for all we had done, and we have done a lot in terms of sanctions and in terms of direct military assistance. But again, as anybody in his place would do, he asked for more. And my guess is over time he'll get more. Now, Congress had already responded with $14 billion worth of both lethal and humanitarian aid in the appropriations bills that were passed last week. One of the reasons I voted for that bill, and its two separate halves, is because Ukrainian aid was in both halves, and I felt like the Ukrainians needed the help, no question. And they've put everything we've given them to very, very good use. I'm not sure where Congress will go next. I have actually dropped a resolution this week urging, it's called the Sense of the Congress resolution. It basically urges the President of the United States to do what he so far failed to do, and that's actually make sure that the Ukrainians get Polish MiGs so that they can do a better job of engaging the Russian Air Force and protecting their own troops and cities on the ground. And I think that's warranted. It's warranted by the escalation on the side of the Russians. The bombing over the last week has become increasingly indiscriminate. We've seen schools targeted, hospitals targeted, humanitarian relief efforts thwarted. This really is not precision strike warfare. It's mass destruction on an almost World War II scale. And that means the Russians have upped the game, so to speak, and I think the Americans ought to match them. I'm not favor of sending in our own military. Again, we have no obligation to do that, but I do think it's very much in our interest and the interest of the West to make sure that Ukrainians have everything they possibly can to continue to mount the spirited resistance that they've shown so far. Again, it's an extraordinary moment, and my guess is President Zelenskyy will get ever more support from the United States, simply because he, and much more profoundly, the Ukrainian people have shown they'll fight. They'll use what we give them, and we ought to listen to their requests very carefully when they tell us what they need and what would make a difference for them. So again, I think we can go further than we have, although I certainly don't denigrate what we've done so far. We've done a lot more than I think people would have expected, but frankly, so is all of Europe. And this is not the United States alone. There are other countries that have provided and offered to provide, armed aid, even above and beyond what we've done. Again, the Poles clearly want to give the Ukrainians aircraft. We've stopped that. Slovakia clearly wants to send them a more robust air defense system. So far, it looks like we've nixed that, or at least have not okayed that, and they won't do it until we do it. So until we make it clear that it's okay with us. I mean, you can't underestimate the influence that the United States has in a situation like this. Everybody knows that we're the leader of the free world, and we're certainly the preeminent power in NATO, not by a little bit, but by a long shot. So while people want to be more aggressive maybe than we do, they're not likely to do it unless we okay it. They want to move in concert with the United States, and that's a good thing, not a bad thing, but it means maybe we need to lean forward a little bit more than we have so far. So hopefully this resolution will have a little bit of an impact, and we'll see what it does, but at least puts back on the table for discussion something that the administration, I think, unfortunately took off the table last week, and we need to do that. We also had a much more mundane matter, a hearing in the Rules Committee this week to try to deal with something that we all know is over, and that is the emergency conditions generated by the pandemic. I don't want to underplay the pandemic or COVID-19. I hope you've taken your vaccine. If you haven't, I hope you do. And if you have, I hope you have your booster. And when there are other requirements coming forward, I hope you'll take note of them and respond accordingly. But in the end, that's your decision. What we do know is deaths, hospitalizations, infections are way down. And we see America returning back to work and trying to get back to as normal as we possibly can. Congress needs to do the same thing. We implemented some extraordinary measures in Congress over the last 2 years. We've never had proxy voting in the entire history of the United States, and that's even when the Capitol was burned down by the British, even when the Capitol was under threat during the Civil War, even when we had pandemic in 1918 that was, if anything, more deadly than the one we're dealing with now. The Capitol stayed open, Congress functioned more or less as usual. Now, I'm not suggesting some of the steps we took were not in order, and I think it is appropriate to move slowly and to try and keep people safe, but we don't need to proxy vote anymore. That ought to be ended right now. Members need to be at work, showing up just the same way as grocery clerks and truck drivers and farmers and people that work at food packing plants stayed at work all through the recession. There's no excuse for Congress not to be physically present and doing its job. That makes a big difference in what we do. We ought to look again at some of the other restrictions. We need to open up the Capitol again. Most businesses are open up, but the Capitol and the Capitol complex remains very hard to access for the average American. That's just simply not right. So anyway, we had a hearing to talk about these things, discuss them. I can assure you that if Republicans take over next January, these things will all be immediately done away with. We might as well do that now. Other American businesses are doing it. and it's time to do it. Other than that, it was actually a pretty quiet week in the House, probably largely because last week we were focused day after day on the appropriations process. They were very long days, so Congress is catching its breath a little bit. There have been minor bills on the floor, nothing particularly important or consequential. So the big things this week, obviously, with the Zelenskyy address, which I think will have a profound impact over time on what Congress does. And if anything, Congress is, on a bipartisan basis, I must say, probably more sympathetic to Ukraine than even the administration. And again, I appreciate everything the Biden administration has done in this case. I just think we need to do more. And then I also think as Congress thinks through what it did through the pandemic, it will undo those things either gradually in the weeks and months ahead or pretty dramatically when January comes around, if there's a change in the House of Representatives. The Senate, by the way, has functioned through the crisis with many fewer restrictions than the House. You're not required to wear a mask. You never were in the United States Senate, although you certainly had that option. They never allowed proxy voting. Some of my Democratic friends said, well, we did all these things so we could function during the pandemic. Again, I would point out the Senate managed to function without doing a lot of these things, and anything that got done here, and there's a big debate as to whether very much got done, but my Democratic friends would argue a lot did. The American Rescue Plan, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, regardless, again, it had to get through the Senate too. So if they could operate without some of the restrictions we have on the House side, we ought to be able to do the same thing on literally the other side of the same building in which they operate. So I look forward to visiting with you again. Probably will not chat with you next week. Congress is not in session. There's actually a Republican retreat as Republicans think through what they want to put on the table in front of the American public in the upcoming midterm elections. But once we get back, hopefully Congress will be back into more normal routine, and certainly the appropriations process for next year is already underway, and we'll have a lot more to talk about. So be safe. Look forward to visiting with you soon, probably week after next.